And certainly compared with the first reports, we're seeing an expanding number of participating countries. Another feature of this present report is that it fully includes the vaping industry and will continue to do so from now on in future reports. And just reading through the report, the thing that really strikes me is how the tobacco industry and its allies continue to use a relentless slew of tactics to overwhelm and undermine protective measures that governments have even already put in place. And the reality is that there's no country left untouched or immune from tobacco industry interference index. So I'd really like to thank the GGTC for putting this report together, and also thank Bloomberg Philanthropies for funding the report. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Adriana Blanco, who's the head of the Convention Secretariat of the WHO FCTC, and she will give a talk on the way forward in enhancing the implementation of Article 5.3. So Dr. Adriana.
I see I was muted. Thank you. I was saying hello to Professor McKay, and a pleasure for being with the most dangerous person of the world. So, dear members of the Global Center for Good Governance in Tobacco Control, or the GGTC, Permanent Secretary from Ministry of Health of Botswana, Professor Noransama, esteemed colleagues and participants. It is really a pleasure to be here today for this virtual launch of the Global Tobacco Industry Interference of 2023. This index shows that the tobacco industry has been, more than ever, aggressively interfering with public health policies in many countries. Some countries have shown their commitment, including recommendations from the guidelines for implementation of Article 5.3 in their legislation or bills on tobacco control. However, it's worrisome to see that while 29 countries have improved their situation, 43 have seen a deterioration of the interference index. Obviously, we all know that the tobacco industry profits from a product that kills, impoverishes people and countries, and destroys the environment. The industry thrives by attracting new users and keeping them addicted, even if it means killing almost half of them. Despite these cruel realities, industry efforts to undermine tobacco control never cease. The global tobacco industry chronicles the industry appealing tactics. So in the way forward in this, we know that parties of the WHO FCTC have recognized in the preamble of the convention the need to be alert to any effort by the tobacco industry to undermine or subvert tobacco control efforts, and the need to be informed of activities of the tobacco industry that have a negative impact on tobacco control efforts. Further in the text, Article 5.3 requests parties to act to protect public health policies with respect to tobacco control from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. The guidelines for implementation of Article 5.3 elaborate further, and they recognize the irreconcilable conflict within the interest of public health and the interest of the tobacco industry, adding the need to address the interests not only of the industry, but also of those who work to further its interests. And this is more relevant now than ever, obviously. The WHO FCTC is a commitment taken by countries as a whole, and its mandates in general, but the mandates of the Article 5.3 and its guidelines for implementation in particular, apply to the entire government, not only to the Ministry of Health. And that is one of the most concerning things when we see that there is a fail in understanding that really Article 5.3 involves every single part of any branch of the government in any level, and is not only a responsibility of the Ministry of Health. The interference by the tobacco industry and its front group continue to be identified by the parties as the main obstacle for the implementation of the treaty in the report to the Conference of the Parties. This interference, while keep on showing the same old pattern, has added new features trying to portray the industry as a partner in the development agenda, providing solutions to the problems that they have created and profited from. The entire tobacco control community has to be aligned and together now more than ever. The tobacco industry is saying that the WHO FCTC is not fit for purpose anymore. Why then they oppose every single effort that countries make to implement it? They are also portraying us, the tobacco control community, as divided, confronting each other. I think that we have much more in common than not, and the main common goal is to end the unnecessary suffering that this industry has created. And to end it for good, not to create a new generation of addicts with products allegedly directed to current smokers, but fiercely marketed to children and adolescents, just to keep the tobacco industry profits intact. So let me congratulate all of you for this effort, and I hope that in the way forward, the next year, the index will bring much better news with more countries increasing their efforts against tobacco industry and not going down in that effort. So thank you very much, and I hope you can have a very successful rest of the meeting. Unfortunately, you know that we are in a difficult situation now in the convention trying to reschedule the conference of the parties and the meeting of the party, and I will need to leave you right after my presentation. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Adriana, and thank you so much for coming and speaking and opening, in fact, this webinar when the FCTC is, as you've said, under a particularly difficult time. We really, really appreciate that. So our next speaker, in fact, will be Dr. Mary Assunta, who's head of global research and advocacy at the GGTC, and more importantly in this context, is the principal author of the Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And Mary will just give us a run through of really the 9 country reports and some of the main findings from the 2023 index. So over to Mary.
Thank you, Judith. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Global Center for Good Governance in Tobacco Control, I'm pleased to present the main findings of the Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index 2023. I want to first express my sincere thanks to all the collaborators from the 90 countries who worked hard to get their country indices done. And many of you are here today. Without your effort, we would not have been able to compile the Global Tobacco Index 2023. So thank you very much. Next, please. Next slide, please. All parties to the WHO FCTC, that's 183 governments, are obligated to implement Article 5.3, which requires them to protect tobacco control policies from commercial and other vested interests. As mentioned by Dr. Adriana just now, what is often missing is that this article should apply and must apply to the whole of government and not just the departments of health. Next, please. This index is a report card on how well governments are implementing Article 5.3. It covers 7 indicators based on the sub-recommendations from the guidelines covering policy development, if governments accepted tobacco-related CSR activities, if any benefits were given to the tobacco industry, unnecessary industry interaction, transparency in interaction with the industry, conflicts of interest, and what measures governments adopted to protect public health. Next, please. The 2023 index found that the tobacco industry has intensified its interference in public health policy and undermined government efforts. Many governments were influenced by the industry, mainly because they failed to act cohesively when dealing with the tobacco industry. No country has been spared from the interference, and the trend is worsening. Overall, more countries deteriorated in their scores compared to the 29 countries who improved. Next, please. So civil society groups ranked 90 countries on how they are implementing their obligation under Article 5.3. The top 5 performing countries are Brunei, New Zealand, France, Netherlands, and Botswana. I want to point out that these countries who have performed well are from different regions, and they exercised political will in protecting public health. At the other end of the spectrum is the Dominican Republic, Switzerland, Japan, Indonesia, and Georgia, who all faced high levels of industry interference. They favored the industry, and this is reflected in their poor tobacco control measures. 3 of these countries are non-parties to the FCTC. Next, please. Industry participation in policy development. 5 countries reported that the tobacco industry sabotaged their efforts to pass comprehensive tobacco control legislation, such as in Bolivia, Guatemala, Jamaica, Tanzania, and Zambia. Non-health departments, especially finance, commerce, and customs, continued to be targeted by the industry and were persuaded by exaggerated claims of industry's contribution to the economy and believed the industry's narrative that illicit tobacco trade will worsen if taxes are increased. Hence, in some countries, such as Colombia, Mongolia, Malaysia, and Turkey, there was no tax increase, while in several others, there were delays in tax payments. Applying pictorial health warnings on tobacco packs was delayed in 4 countries, and that's in Chad, Bangladesh, Lao PDR, and Nigeria. And the implementation of standardized tobacco packaging has been undermined by the industry in Georgia, Myanmar, and Uruguay. In Uruguay, Egypt, and Kenya, the tobacco industry lobbied to revoke bans on e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches. Next, please. Many governments still accepted CSR handouts from the tobacco industry. These CSR activities were focused on post-COVID-19 recovery, contributing to relief efforts in natural disasters, environmental protection, such as cigarette butt cleanups or tree planting. Governments and public institutions endorsed industry-led cigarette butt litter cleanups in at least 15 countries, including Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Korea, Malaysia, Sweden, Switzerland, and Uruguay. When governments accept charity from the tobacco industry, they subject themselves to compromising on public health policies. Next, please. The industry benefits when governments fail to increase tax, grant delays in implementing tax increases, allow exemptions or waivers, apply differential tax increases across tobacco products, and tax rebates. Switzerland and Uruguay still provide subsidy for tobacco cultivation, and duty-free cigarettes and tobacco products are still allowed in most countries. Next, please. Unnecessary interaction. Article 5.3 calls on governments to limit their interaction with the tobacco industry to only when strictly necessary for regulation. But many countries engaged in various types of unnecessary interactions. High-ranking public officers in at least 12 countries gave special recognition to tobacco companies for paying taxes, doing charity, or just conducting its business. Korea, Bangladesh, Nepal, Turkey, Lebanon, and Japan. Diplomatic missions of 5 countries, and that is China, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, were persuaded to promote the tobacco industry in other countries. Next slide, please. Conflict of interest situations. Policymakers in many countries made themselves vulnerable to industry interference by placing themselves in situations of conflict of interest. This happens either through accepting tobacco industry donations for political campaigns or investing in the tobacco business. A revolving door situation of retiring senior government officials joining tobacco companies or industry executives taking up senior government positions also created undue industry influence on health policies. Governments of 10 countries surveyed continue to invest in tobacco business either through tobacco state-owned enterprises or having administrative functions over tobacco corporations. Often these come under the purview of the departments of finance, whose fiduciary duty is to ensure the profitability of tobacco business, potentially conflicting with health objectives to reduce tobacco use. Next slide, please. Transparency and accountability remained a problem across countries. Many of the countries do not have rules for disclosure of meetings with the tobacco industry or a register of lobbyists or policies to require the tobacco industry to disclose information on marketing and lobbying. However, on the positive side, there is a register of lobbyists in Canada, Chile, Mexico, the Netherlands, Poland, and the USA. Canada, the EU, New Zealand, and UK inform the public about meetings with the tobacco industry on their websites. However, enforcement remains an issue for some countries that have transparency requirements. Next slide, please. So what have governments done to protect themselves and the policies? There is positive news of countries that have made good effort to implement Article 5.3. Brunei Darussalam, Uganda, and the Netherlands, for example, are implementing their sector-wide codes of conduct on Article 5.3 guidelines or through legislation. Botswana has incorporated elements of good governance into their amended Tobacco Control Act. Botswana government now prohibits its agencies and officials from accepting any contribution or gift from the tobacco industry. Next slide, please. Moving forward, governments can and must halt tobacco industry interference. The quicker they act to fulfill their obligations under the WHO FCTC, the better they can protect and advance their tobacco control policies. So our recommendations are: the whole of government must act cohesively to stop tobacco industry interference. They must stop accepting or endorsing tobacco industry-sponsored charity. In fact, governments need to denormalize and ban tobacco CSR activities and make the tobacco industry pay for the harms its products cause on human health and the environment. Greater transparency is needed when dealing with the tobacco industry to reduce instances of interference. Stop giving incentives to the tobacco industry, and the industry should not be granted preferential treatment to run its business, which conflicts with tobacco control policy. Implement a code of conduct or guidance to provide a firewall, and governments must adopt clear guidance to limit interactions with the industry when strictly necessary. And governments must divest from all tobacco business to avoid conflict of interest. Next slide, please, will be my final slide. The Global Tobacco Index, regional indices and details are available on the Global Tobacco Index and STOP website. Country indices and country fact sheets are also available on the Global Tobacco Index website. I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, and congratulations to the team again. So the next part of the seminar, we will have 4 presentations looking at the index, protecting against it, country reports, the key industry interference issues confronting governments and tobacco control. And in this section, speakers, the first one I'm really pleased to welcome Mr. Vinayak Prasad, who is a unit head of what is now called the No Tobacco Unit, but still the TFI at World Health Organization. And Vinayak will talk to us about tobacco-related CSR. Mary mentioned this, how important it was for governments not to accept gifts from the industry. A foot in the door challenge for government. So over to you, Vinayak. We'd be really pleased to have your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Judith, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues and distinguished members of the panel. And first of all, I must congratulate GGTC for bringing out the index. It was right on time. Unfortunately, COP got deferred, but hope it will still be relevant early in 2024. And it's an important reminder to countries to look at these indexes to see how they are comparing and faring vis-a-vis other countries in the region and globally. So I will reflect on corporate social responsibility. Normally, it's considered a good thing. And a country where I come from, India, there's a law actually to put 2% of the profits into CSR. And if they don't do, the companies get penalized. So next slide, please. So corporate social responsibility generally is looking into how we create and cultivate a perception of positive impact on social and environmental concerns. And we'll broadly look at some of these issues, especially in the sectors outside of health, where sometimes the policymakers do not recognize the inherent conflict of engagement, but also how it adversely influences policymaking. Next slide, please. So what is the concern? And I'm not reading, these are slides for placeholders for those who really want to go into exact definitions. But why is it that we are concerned from the world of tobacco control? What is it that the tobacco industry is ending up doing? And I will just pull out from Article 5.3 FCTC guidelines that through CSRs, basically what's happening is that the tobacco industry is trying to distance itself from the lethal nature of the product. And more important is also trying to appear to be socially responsible, and yet at the same time promoting the product. And that is a very important point for consideration as to how they end up promoting their product and influencing regulatory processes as part of their CSR game. Next slide, please. So let's just take some examples. And one of the most favorite topics of the tobacco industry is agriculture. It's more than 4 million hectares of land engaged in tobacco, growing 80 countries. There are at least 30 countries in the world that do not do tobacco control just because there is a perception that tobacco growing is great for the economy. And how does the tobacco industry create additional perceptions of value? I mean, just like the case of Bangladesh, where British American tobacco is looking into afforestation. Now, many of us know that to cure 1 acre of leaf produced tobacco leaf, they have to cut 10 trees. So can you imagine, just 10 acres, 100 trees, 10 years, 1,000 trees, 1 farmer. And so where's the tree left? So the industry has gone into afforestation and getting members of parliament or politicians to go and plant trees. So that's like a big thing. The next thing, I'll just give an example from India. The Indian Tobacco Company, the largest tobacco company in India, runs one of the largest CSR programs, supporting 30,000 farmers, running schools, running hospitals, running, they call it eChopal, which is like a marketplace to help get the farmers the best price for whatever they are trying to sell. Again, these are all supposed to be helping them in good governance and helping the farmers appearing to be good. Next slide, please. So let me come to another area, which is a huge concern, given that the industry has managed to put children into tobacco growing and tobacco farming. But then the face of it is that we are trying to help children get out of tobacco farming. And so they're running these projects with support of ECLT and other front groups, where they are saying we are helping the children get out of tobacco. And I'm just giving some examples. Looking at China, Project Hope, which was not much is known outside, but they are supporting hundreds of schools and getting the children from tobacco farms to go into these schools. Likewise, there are projects funded by Japan Tobacco, JTI, in a number of African countries, which actually is working as a barrier to move out the tobacco farmers into other crops, and then in the process blocking the entire tobacco control bill, for example, in Zambia. Next slide, please. So I would come to something which is closer to the health sector. Whenever there is a catastrophe, whenever there is an earthquake, disaster, whenever there was any of these pandemics happen, who are the first to jump in other than the relief workers and the health workers? The tobacco industry. They're always there, visible, appearing to be supporting. So tobacco causes lung and other related disease, but tobacco also is supporting supplies of ventilators and masks, which is what we saw. I mean, at the end of the COVID pandemic, we even saw Philip Morris make an investment announcement of Medicago, a vaccine, with working with the Canadian government. And after a lot of effort, all those strategies were discussed with different stakeholder groups to pinpoint why it is a challenge to get the tobacco industry to be involved in any of these activities. Next slide, please. And so there's a lot which needs to be discussed in the environmental space. And WHO ran a campaign last year on World on Tobacco Day, highlighting some of these issues. But the industry is also trying to play the game, especially in the CSR space, looking at climate smart agriculture, looking for CSR rating, and getting a very high rating. So how does that then influence policy making is something really interesting to watch, because the industry then comes on to the policymaker and creates a dialogue using some of these strategies. Next slide, please. So I mentioned disaster resilience. So we saw that in the earthquake recently, in Turkey, and then more recently we've seen Philip Morris the strategies in light of Ukraine. And because of the Ukraine-Russian war, they've actually gone out and reached out to a number of countries in Europe to make investment proposals and us offering to scale up some of their CSR activities. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, it is very important for anyone who works in the world of tobacco control and engages with the policymakers and the governments, is that CSR by tobacco industry has almost always been used to engage the governments to manipulate policy making. And it's important to recognize that the sectors outside of the health, which are very vulnerable, are environment, agriculture, social development, those relating to rural development, child labor issues, and home affairs, which is the disaster management and all of that. And these governments and the ministries really need to be sensitized, and there's an opportunity to do that, then we should definitely work on that. Next slide, please. So what would be my key takeaway? It's always important to remind the parties to the FCTC on Article 5.3 and the whole of government approach to 5.3 and also to FCTC, and to denormalize the tobacco industry's activities, whether it's CSR or other commercial activities. It's important to use every opportunity to bring out these issues. And it's something which, as tobacco control advocates, which I believe all of us are, we should work towards ensuring that the industry does not use CSR as a way to get into through the door into the government. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to all of you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vinayak, for that excellent presentation. And I know this whole business of CSR is really one of the major findings in this report, and just how the tobacco industry is using it. So really important to highlight it and look at what must be done. So thank you very much again. So questions at this point, because we have 4 speakers in this section, questions will go to the end when we have the open forum shortly. So our next speaker is Mr. Dudley Tarleton, the Programme Specialist, Health and Development in the UNDP. And he will be speaking about applying Article 5.3 to non-health departments targeted by the industry. So over to you, Dudley.
Thanks, Judith, and hi, colleagues. Nice to be with everyone again. I'll be quite brief and look forward to answering any questions anyone has. I feel like I've given the same presentation in the previous launch of the version, and I can give a little bit of an update on the trends as we found them. I'm presenting as a avid consumer of the Tobacco Industry Interference Index. Our team at UNDP have been using the findings of the index since the first time it was released, and we really look forward to each time some new numbers come out and to integrating them into the work we do. And here specifically, I've looked at how we've been integrating these numbers into the tobacco control investment cases that we've done with the Secretariat of the FCTC, with WHO, and most prominently with the governments and health ministries in the countries where we've done these. Next slide, please. So just a quick look at the geography of where we've done these. We've fully launched the tobacco control cases in 21 of these countries in pink. And the 18 countries that are in progress, the work is essentially done on these. They've been, for the most part, cleared. And we're just getting ready to launch the rest of them. So the numbers draw from most of these, 39 cases. Next, please. Just to take a quick stock of the numbers, on average, we're not just talking about old people dying, even though that is something we do want to prevent and avoid to the great extent we can. 59% of the deaths of the countries we've looked at are among people younger than 70, which qualifies as premature deaths. And the overall per capita burden in these countries is $92 per year. And that's for each person in the country. That's the average cost of tobacco use generally to the population, not specific to tobacco users. Next one, please. And again, what kind of a return do we get on investing in tobacco control? We find on average 18 deaths avoided per $10,000 invested in tobacco control. So really, really highly cost-effective interventions here with significant health impacts. And we saw in the previous slide, the cost, here the benefits over a 15-year period, $254 per capita. That's, again, every man, woman, child in the country, not just the tobacco using public. And if in a perfect world where every country implements each recommended intervention, and usually we have on average, I'd say 6 or 7 interventions we look at, countries would see in this 15-year period a nearly half decline in tobacco use prevalence and cigarette smoking specifically. Next one, please. So looking specifically in the recommendations, so each one of these investment cases makes a small set of recommendations. It isn't just do these interventions that we modeled, a little bit more nuanced about how can you get the work done? How can you accomplish what you need to? What are the strategies to use? And so predictably, Article 5.3 in addressing tobacco industry interference really is figuring more and more prominently. And if we look at the first phase of 15 countries that we did a few years ago, about 1 in 5 of the recommendations had something specifically on preventing tobacco industry interference. Big jump in the next phase as we learned, and we got more and more requests from health ministry specifically to include a recommendation on this. And that's even been extended further into the latest batch of 17 or 18 cases that are ready to go now. Nearly universal recognition of implementation of Article 5.3 as a priority. And these are expressions of prioritization from the health ministries themselves. And overall, we're up to more than half of the cases have a recommendation on implementation of 5.3. Next one, please. And here's just I don't want to put too much emphasis on this one because the y-axis makes the numbers look more varied than they are. The scores have been relatively consistent, but these are how each of the countries where we've done the investment cases has done over the last 4 tobacco industry interference index scoring. And you could see, of course, we know the lower score, the better. So a worrying jump in 2020 numbers, and then very minor decreases going down since then. On average, though, compared to the universe of countries participating in the index, the ones asking for and receiving investment case support, slightly higher than the overall global average. So we can assume that the countries asking for support recognize both that tobacco industry interference is a problem and that they know the ways how to use the FCTC to address it. Happy to answer any questions if anybody has. Next one, please. And thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dudley. That 2020 peak, do you think that was related to COVID in any way?
I think the numbers may have been set before. It could be the reflection could be in there. So I would guess not. And again, it looks like it's a big peak, but it's a relatively consistent number in aggregate.
Right, thank you. So if people can save their questions for Dudley till the end. Thanks very much indeed, Dudley. And our third speaker in this session is Lilia Olafia, who's the director of the Smoke-Free Partnerships. And she will be speaking about accountability remaining a problem in Article 5.3 implementation. So over to you, Lilia.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and share with you the experience on implementing a recommendation on transparency and how it's connected to accountability and some of the key lessons learned from the European region. Next slide, please. Next slide. So Smoke-Free Partnership is a coalition of over 50 organizations that work in Europe, and some of those organizations that are members of our coalition, they were also authors of the national report. So this time, next one please, this time the index covers 20 countries, and if we look at those countries, we see that they are ranging from the best performing countries such as France and Netherlands, and worst performing countries such as Switzerland, Georgia, and Romania. Next slide, please. While looking at the national reports from 20 countries from the European region, one of the questions that we have to answer, and that actually arises not just from the work that we are doing on preventing the tobacco industry interference and working with governments to inform them that they have tools to ensure that public health policies are protected, is to understand what kind of transparency leads to what kind of accountability and under what conditions. When we look at most of the countries in the region, we can actually see that they have some sort of disclosure requirements, but mostly only upon request by third parties. And we lack specific rules that oblige the tobacco industry to register their entities in some sort of the transparency register. And if there are transparency registers, of course, they're applicable to the lobbyist groups, not just the tobacco industry. And the way the tobacco industry, we know it works, that it tends to find various loopholes to avoid transparency and still not be and prevent civil society also from uncovering all of the incidents. So while reflecting on a matter of transparency and accountability, we do see that it goes step by step. In a sense, first, of course, we want to have some kind of a transparency register, but then how do we make sure that the front groups that work for the tobacco industry, that we know that they are linked to the tobacco industry? And then when we look at the matter of disclosing any meetings and also publishing the meeting notes, how do we move to the next stage, from stage one, where we just have an obligation quite often in those countries that implement this rule that applies only to the ministries of health or health departments, but doesn't have the whole government requirement obligation. And we do know that the tobacco industry tends to target not mostly other ministries and departments on trade, consumers, economy, etc. So it should be the whole government approach. And then how do we move not from accessing those notes on the meetings upon sending a request from civil society or media to making it mandatory and to making it a standard practice. And then the next step is when we talk about accountability, moving from accountability that citizens and civil society can call on governments and ensure that there is that kind of accountability to making it a formal accountability. So there is a lot of food for thought, but working on national indexes, we actually can observe a progress that is made in certain countries in the European region, particularly France and Poland have partial disclosure requirements for interactions with the tobacco industry. And they are making progress in that direction. Next slide, please. So here you can see that still most of the countries, they don't have the proper transparency rules. However, we have some good practices in the region. Next slide. I did talk a little bit about the necessity concept and how we move from identifying when the meetings are absolutely necessary and most of the meetings are not, and then they shouldn't be taking place at all. And this is directly related to ensuring not just the transparency matter, but if the meetings that were not absolutely necessary to took place, how do we ensure accountability? And then the concept of proactive transparency, it's quite often used by civil society that works on anti-corruption, transparency, and this is something that we should be looking more to understand that transparency is not something that we should be requesting. It's something that should be established to allow us to have a proper research and again, transparency registers, disclosure of meetings. This is the basis where that is already implemented in at least half of the countries in the European region. Next slide, please. To summarize, again, if we look at what our colleagues are doing who are working on transparency and accountability globally, there are different stages and concepts and philosophical approaches to understanding transparency, from opaque transparency, clear transparency, to and then soft accountability and hard accountability. So we know what needs to be done further, but it takes usually at least 1 or 2 countries, and then it always has a domino effect. That's why the global index does encourage and provide countries with tools to implement the best practices on transparency and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lilia, for that excellent presentation. We're now moving to the last speaker in this session, and this is Professor Watokwat Komazana, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Botswana. And Mary mentioned Botswana at the beginning in terms of some of the action that they've taken under Article 5.3. And I think it will be really helpful, really useful for us to actually hear what the government itself has got to say. So the title of this presentation is Adopting Provisions of Article 5.3 and its Guidelines in National Law, Botswana's Tobacco Control Act. So over to our speaker, Watokwat. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I think we'll just move right on to the next slide. So this is really sharing experience, how as a country a decision was made to adopt Article 5.3 and develop a control act, which is basically a law that controls how controls tobacco use in the country. So we can move on to the next slide. Botswana does have a significantly high prevalence of tobacco use of an overall 18%, and which is more prevalent in men at 27%, but still significant in women at 9%. And that ranges from both cigarette smoking and e-cigarette. And Botswana is burdened with HIV, you know, but now we're seeing another epidemic of non-communicable diseases. So Botswana is now struggling with a double epidemic, and the NCDs, as we all know, are caused by a lifestyle. They are lifestyle diseases which include tobacco use. Unfortunately, we don't often have really accurate data on how much the contribution of tobacco use is, but it's significant, just based on the prevalence of smoking. And also this also becomes an added risk for those living with HIV infection. And Botswana has also another growing challenge with cancer as part of the non-communicable diseases, ranging about 5%, the cancer deaths, or cancer contributing 5% of all deaths, and almost 20% of the cancers being associated with tobacco use. So tobacco use has a significant contribution to mortality and morbidity in the country. And next slide, please. So I suppose this is just the steps towards adopting Article 5.3. And I want to go into Article 5.3 because it's already been clearly and well explained by the previous speakers. And so what Botswana did is that we passed a law passed by the National Assembly in 2021 called the Tobacco Control Act. And at the moment, the country is developing regulations that are also adopted from Article 5.3 that would actually make it possible to implement or that give teeth to the act in the country. Next slide, please. So the Tobacco Control Act that, as I said, was passed in 2021, it repealed the Control of Smoking Act of 1992, and its attempts to be fully compliant with Article 5.3 of in terms of interaction of public body with the tobacco industry. It does require full transparency on any interactions with the tobacco industry, which should take place only when deemed necessary. That is the interaction with tobacco industry, and that is for effective regulation. And also prohibits any partnership, agreement, or contribution, including voluntary contribution, CSR, as we just heard, from the tobacco industry to any public body. And we can, next slide, please, which includes all of government. So the Minister of Health, the Act empowers the Ministry of Health to be able to prescribe information and manner of reporting that manufacturers and importers of tobacco shall provide to the committee and the public about tobacco products and their emissions, including sales data and information on product composition. And also empowers him to insist that to prescribe additional requirements and prohibitions to protect tobacco control policies from the commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. And next slide, please. So other key provisions of the new law is a total ban on tobacco advertising and promotion and sponsorship, and a ban on the display of tobacco products, including at the point of sale, and requires that pictorial health warnings cover not less than 70% of each principal display area and be written in the official languages. It also bans the inclusion of deceptive terms such as light, ultralight, and slim in the packaging and labeling of tobacco products. This is an important component of the law because on estimate 90% of cigarette sales is single sticks. Next slide, please. So we've just heard, and we are glad to know that we've made significant progress as far as the index tobacco industry, as the global, as the index that we've scored 33 points and compared to 50 in 2021. And so that one step seemed to have made significant inroads in the fight against influence by the tobacco industry. There were, of course, intimidation and threats by, for instance, the British American Tobacco Botswana, and we challenged the minister in writing, arguing that the regulation was excessive and ill thought out, and that the prohibition of display and branding of tobacco products was unconstitutional and infringed on Botswana's intellectual property and trademark laws. So I have run out of time, but I think in essence is to say the next stage is really to ensure that the regulations are developed and are being implemented, and to be vigilant to ensure that the gains, which sometimes can be fragile, are not lost, because this is a war that will continue for a while. Other than that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.